They didn't build Derinkuyu to survive a storm. They built it to survive something that made the surface unlivable. 20 levels down, stone doors that seal from the inside, choke point tunnels designed to trap intruders, ventilation shafts hidden so an entire population could vanish without smoke or sound. This was engineered for a prolonged siege against a relentless enemy. If burying thousands alive was the safer option, what was powerful enough to make the sky itself a threat? In 1963, a homeowner in the Cappadocian town of Derinkuyu was renovating his basement when he knocked through a wall. Behind it, he found a hidden chamber. Behind that chamber, another room, then a tunnel. The tunnel went down. He followed it. Down through soft volcanic rock. Down past one level. Then another. Then another. When archaeologists finally mapped what he'd discovered, they realized the scale was staggering. The complex dropped 85 meters into the earth. 280 feet straight down. 18 levels carved by hand from volcanic tuff. Miles of corridors connecting hundreds of rooms. Ventilation shafts. Deep water wells. Storage chambers. Wine presses. Animal stalls. Kitchens. Chapels. Schools. This was Derinkuyu Underground City, the largest subterranean complex ever discovered in Cappadocia. And here's what doesn't let go. It could shelter 20,000 people. Not for days, not for a week, for months, maybe longer. The ventilation system still works. 52 shafts running from the surface to the lowest levels, some over 55 meters deep. Air still flows naturally through chambers, carved over 2,000 years ago. The wells still tap into protected aquifers. Water sources unreachable from the surface, positioned with geological precision. And then there are the doors. Massive circular stones, 400 to 1,000 pounds each, rolling on carved tracks, sealing corridors from the inside. Each level could be isolated independently. Once those doors closed, nobody was getting in. Someone built this. Multiple generations, actually. The earliest sections date back to the 8th century BC, maybe older. The city expanded over centuries. But here's the question that matters. Why? Why carve an entire functioning city into solid rock? Why descend 18 levels? Why infrastructure for 20,000 people? Why doors that seal you inside? What were they hiding from? The conventional answer is invasion. Central Anatolia endured centuries of warfare. Hittites, Persians, Romans, Arab-Byzantine conflicts, Mongols. Having a refuge makes sense. But here's what doesn't add up. You don't build something this elaborate for occasional raids. Raids last days. You could hide in caves for that. You could flee to the mountains. This is different. This is architecture of sustained fear. This is what you build when the threat isn't temporary, when you know it's coming back, when you know you'll need to vanish underground for months at a time, when survival means sealing yourself away from the sky entirely. And Derinkuyu isn't alone. Archaeologists have discovered dozens of underground cities across Cappadocia: Kaymakli, Özkonak, Tatlarin, hundreds of smaller tunnel complexes, some connected through miles of passages carved through solid rock. You could travel between cities without ever seeing daylight. An entire regional civilization went underground, not once, repeatedly, across generations. The question isn't just what they were hiding from. It's what did they understand about recurring catastrophe that we've forgotten? What pattern did they recognize clearly enough to justify abandoning the surface world? What made 20,000 people choose stone ceilings over open sky? Because building an underground city isn't difficult. It's impossible. You're not digging a cellar. You're not carving out storage rooms. You're excavating an estimated 2.5 million cubic feet of volcanic rock by hand, with bronze and iron tools, no explosives, and no machinery, no modern engineering. And somehow the math has to work perfectly the first time. The rock at Derinkuyu is called tuff, compressed volcanic ash, millions of years old, soft enough to carve when first exposed, hard enough to hold weight once it cures in open air. That's the good news. The bad news is it's still rock. And someone removed 2.5 million cubic feet of it, by hand. Let's be clear about what that means. You're not chipping away at a hillside. You're not quarrying stone for a temple. You're excavating downward, into darkness, creating void where there was none. Every room hollowed out, every corridor carved, every staircase cut into solid stone. And here's what archaeologists can't find: the debris. 2.5 million cubic feet of rock doesn't just disappear. There's no massive rubble pile near the city, no ancient dump site filled with volcanic tuff, no quarry packed with leftover stone. The rock is gone, either hauled miles away or ground to dust and scattered across the landscape. Both options require labor that borders on the irrational. But that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is the precision. These aren't rough-hewn caves. The walls are smooth. Ceilings curve deliberately. Some chambers have decorative columns carved directly from the bedrock. Passages have steps cut into the floor at consistent intervals. This isn't mining. This is architecture, and they did it in near total darkness. You're 200 feet below ground, no windows, no sunlight. You're working by oil lamp or torch. The smoke from your light source fills the chamber. The air is thin. Oh, you can barely see the wall in front of you. And you're supposed to carve ventilation shafts that run vertically for over 50 meters without deviation. Think about that sequence. The ventilation had to come first. Without airflow, workers would suffocate. You can't have crews operating on 18 levels simultaneously without a functioning air circulation system, which means the first workers had to dig those shafts blind, straight down through solid rock, not knowing if the angle would hold, not knowing if the shaft would collapse, not knowing if air would actually flow once they broke through to the lower levels, just digging through darkness on faith. 52 ventilation shafts throughout the city, some reaching depths of 55 meters, perfectly vertical, 3 feet wide, still functional after more than 2,000 years. Then come the wells, positioned throughout the complex, narrow shafts descending until they puncture underground aquifers, some over 50 meters deep. But here's what shouldn't be possible. They're positioned perfectly. Every well hits water at different depths, which means whoever designed Derinkuyu understood the subsurface geology. They knew where the aquifers were. They knew how deep to dig. They planned the entire city around water sources they couldn't see. There's no trial and error at this scale. You can't dig a test well 50 meters down, miss the aquifer, and just start over 3 meters to the left. Every shaft had to work the first time. The planning had to be flawless. And then consider the timeline. The standard explanation is defense against invasion. Hittites swept through Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BC. Persians followed, then Romans, then Arab forces during the Byzantine period, then Mongols. Wave after wave of armies crossing Cappadocia for over 2,000 years. Having a place to hide makes sense, but raids last days, sieges last weeks. Derinkuyu was designed for months. The food storage chambers are massive. The water system is self-contained. The ventilation sustains 20,000 people indefinitely. This isn't a panic room. This is infrastructure for long-term habitation. Which raises the question nobody wants to ask. What kind of threat returns so regularly, so predictably, that entire communities, generation after generation, choose to refine and expand an underground city rather than abandon the region entirely? What did they know about the surface world that made 85 meters of stone feel safer than open sky? The temperature inside Derinkuyu never changes, 13 degrees Celsius, year-round. No matter the season, no matter the weather on the surface. In summer, when Cappadocia bakes under Mediterranean heat, the underground city remains cool. In winter, when temperatures plunge, the stone holds warmth. This isn't accident. This is thermal mass, geological selection. Someone understood that volcanic tuff doesn't just carve easily, it regulates temperature, which suggests they knew the rock before they carved it. But how do you test that without digging? The central ventilation shaft runs 55 meters straight down through the complex. It's the spine of the entire air circulation system. Without it, every other shaft is useless, and it had to be dug first, before the chambers, before the storage rooms, before any of the 18 levels could be safely excavated. Because without airflow, the workers suffocate. So picture the engineering sequence. You start at the surface. You mark a spot. And you begin digging straight down through solid rock with hand tools. No deviation, no angle correction, just vertical descent. 10 meters down, you're in complete darkness. 20 meters down, you can't hear the surface anymore. 30 meters down, the air is stale. You keep digging. At some point, you have to trust that when you break through to the first level, air will flow, that the shaft won't collapse, that the angle is true. There's no way to check until it's finished, and if you're wrong, everyone below dies. 52 ventilation shafts throughout Derinkuyu, all dug this way, all functional, still moving air after 2,000 years. Then consider the wells. They're not drilled from the bottom up. They're carved from the top down. Narrow channels, 2 feet wide, descending through rock until they puncture aquifers at different depths. Some wells terminate at 30 meters. Others go deeper, 50, 60 meters. Each one hits water. Here's what that means. Whoever planned this knew the subsurface hydrology. They knew where water pooled beneath the surface. They knew the depth of each aquifer layer. They knew which zones were safe and which might be contaminated from surface runoff. And they knew all of this without modern surveying equipment, without ground-penetrating radar, without geological core samples. They just knew. And the wells aren't random. They're positioned strategically, distributed across levels so that if one section is sealed off, it still has independent water access. The wells are also unreachable from the surface. Not a single shaft penetrates all the way through. Every water source terminates inside the city, below ground level. Why? Because surface access means surface vulnerability. An enemy could poison the water, drop contaminants down the shaft, render the entire city uninhabitable. By sealing the wells internally, Derinkuyu's water supply became untouchable. But that decision requires foresight. It requires someone thinking not just about immediate survival, but about siege tactics, about biological warfare, about threats that don't come with swords. This isn't panic construction. All this is multi-generational strategic planning. And the same logic appears in the structural design. The corridors narrow deliberately at certain points. Ceilings drop without warning. Passages twist at sharp angles. These are not flaws, they're choke points. An invader unfamiliar with the layout would be disoriented, slowed, forced into single file, easy to defend, impossible to storm. Meanwhile, the residents knew every turn. But here's the tension. If you're designing for defense, you're designing for invasion. And if you're designing for prolonged siege, you're expecting the threat to last. Not days, not weeks. Long enough that food storage matters, That ventilation redundancy matters. That psychological endurance matters. Which brings us back to the beginning. The temperature never changes. 13 degrees, stable or predictable. In a world where the surface was unstable, unpredictable, and repeatedly hostile, the stone offered something no fortress could: constancy. But constancy requires understanding. You don't stumble into geological perfection. You don't accidentally carve a city that regulates its own climate, purifies its own water, and defends itself through architecture alone. Someone understood the earth, not spiritually, not mythologically, geologically. And the question that should unsettle us is this: how did Bronze Age and Iron Age civilizations possess geological knowledge sophisticated enough to engineer environmental stability 280 feet underground? And why did survival depend on getting it exactly right? The doors only open from one side, not from both, not from the outside, only from within. And each one is a massive circular slab of stone, 3 to 5 feet in diameter, 1 to 2 feet thick, weighing between 400 and 1,000 pounds. They roll on tracks carved directly into the floor. When closed, they seal corridors completely. No gaps, no light, no sound. And there are hundreds of them, distributed across 18 levels, positioned at every critical junction, every stairwell, every passage connecting one section to another. Each level could be isolated independently, which means if the upper levels were breached, the lower levels remained sealed. If invaders broke through the first door, there were 20 more behind it. But here's what that design reveals. These doors weren't meant to hold a siege line. They were meant to erase you. Think about what happens when you close a door that weighs half a ton. You're not fortifying a position. You're not preparing to counterattack. You're vanishing. The corridor design reinforces this. Passages throughout Derinkuyu are deliberately narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. In some sections, you have to turn sideways. Ceilings drop without warning, from 7 feet to 5 feet, then back up. An invader moving through these spaces is constantly disoriented, bent over, off balance, vulnerable, and the passages twist, not gently, not gradually. Sharp angles, sudden turns, intersections that double back on themselves. If you don't know the layout, you're lost within minutes. Meanwhile, at certain junctions, there are small openings carved into the walls near the ceiling, murder holes. Some defensive positions, where residents could strike from above while remaining protected. But here's the strange part. There aren't many of them. For a city designed to hold 20,000 people, the offensive architecture is minimal. There are choke points, yes. There are ambush angles. But the design isn't optimized for prolonged combat. It's optimized for invisibility. You don't fight your way through Derinkuyu. You disappear into it. Close the doors, seal the levels, wait. And that waiting could last months. The food storage chambers are large enough to sustain the population. The water supply is independent. The air circulates naturally. You could survive underground longer than any army could sustain a siege on the surface, which means the doors aren't just defensive, they're psychological. Closing them is a decision, or a commitment. Once sealed, you're betting that whatever is happening on the surface is worse than living in darkness. You're choosing stone over sky, silence over sunlight, confinement over exposure. And you're making that choice not just for yourself, but for your children. Because the doors don't just lock invaders out, they lock you in. There's no quick escape, no rear exit, no emergency route to the surface that bypasses the main passages. If something goes wrong underground, collapse, fire, contaminated water, you're trapped. The same architecture that protects you also confines you, which raises an uncomfortable question. What kind of threat makes entrapment the safer option? What scenario is so terrifying that 20,000 people would willingly seal themselves in darkness, knowing they might not come out for months? Our invasion explains the doors. It doesn't explain the commitment, because rolling those stones into place isn't a temporary measure. It's an acknowledgement that the world above has become uninhabitable, that survival means retreat so complete you're willing to surrender mobility, sunlight, and freedom of movement. The architecture of Derinkuyu isn't just defensive, it's resignation. Resignation to a pattern that repeated often enough, predictably enough, that successive generations refined the system, added more doors, carved deeper levels, expanded storage capacity, not because one invasion traumatized them, but because they knew the next one was coming, and the one after that. The doors are still there. Modern archaeologists have tested them. They still roll. The tracks still function. But the seals still hold. After more than 2,000 years, the mechanism remains operational. Which means, if you stood in those corridors today and pushed one of those massive stone wheels into place, you'd feel the same resistance they felt, the same weight, the same finality, and you'd understand, in a way no historical text can convey, what it meant to choose this. To choose stone ceilings and sealed doors over open sky and sunlight. To choose survival in darkness over exposure to whatever awaited above. The question isn't why they built the doors, it's why they kept using them. Cappadocia sits at the crossroads of empires, always has. If you wanted to move armies between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, you crossed Cappadocia. If you wanted to control trade routes linking Persia to the Aegean, you held Cappadocia. If you wanted to project power across Anatolia, you fought in Cappadocia. For over 3,000 years, this region has been a battlefield. Around 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire collapsed. Not gradually, suddenly. Cities across Anatolia were burned, administrative centers abandoned. The Bronze Age political order disintegrated within decades. Scholars call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. What followed was centuries of instability. Then came the Persians. In the 6th century BC, the Achaemenid Empire absorbed Cappadocia. It became a Persian satrapy, a frontier region, strategically valuable but perpetually contested. When Alexander the Great swept through Anatolia in 333 BC, Cappadocia changed hands again. After Alexander's death, it fractured. Local kingdoms emerged. Then Rome arrived. By the 1st century BC, Cappadocia was annexed into the Roman Empire. But annexation didn't mean peace. Rome's eastern frontier was unstable for centuries. The Parthians invaded repeatedly. Then the Sasanian Persians. Border wars stretched across generations. Cappadocia became a military zone. Legions stationed permanently. Fortifications built and rebuilt. Then, in the 7th century AD, Arab forces swept into Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire struggled to hold the region. For 300 years, 7th through 10th centuries, Cappadocia endured wave after wave of raids. Historical chronicles describe the pattern. Villages burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced. Not once, repeatedly. Byzantine sources record the devastation with bureaucratic precision, tax revenues disappearing, entire districts depopulated, our agricultural production collapsing. And through all of this, Derinkuyu was expanded, because by the Byzantine period, early Christian communities were using the underground cities, not just for military defense, for religious persecution. When Roman authorities cracked down on Christians in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Cappadocian believers retreated underground. Chapels carved into the rock still bear crosses. Evidence of religious services, baptismal chambers, schools where scripture was taught in darkness. These weren't temporary hiding places. They were sanctuaries. And after Christianity became the state religion, the cities remained useful. Because the raids didn't stop, Arab forces didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. So families retreated underground, again and again, for months at a time. But here's the tension. Warfare explains refuge. It doesn't explain scale. 1,000 people could hide from raiders in a cave system, maybe 2,000 if you planned carefully. But 20,000, 18 levels, infrastructure designed for prolonged habitation, that's not emergency shelter, that's societal infrastructure. And it suggests something historians rarely emphasize. The instability wasn't episodic, it was chronic. Cappadocia didn't experience occasional crises. It experienced continuous, multi-generational insecurity, which means children grew up knowing that at some point they would descend into darkness. Parents planned their lives around the certainty of retreat. Communities maintained and expanded underground infrastructure, not as a contingency, but as routine. This isn't crisis response. All this is adaptation. Adaptation to a world where the surface is fundamentally unsafe. But invasion alone doesn't fully explain this, because armies move, they raid, they conquer, they leave. Even occupying forces don't stay forever. Yet, Derinkuyu was designed for something more persistent, something that returned not just across years, but across centuries. And here's what the historical record doesn't answer. If warfare drove people underground repeatedly for over 2,000 years, why didn't they leave? Why stay in a region so contested, so violent, so perpetually unstable, that your survival strategy is to vanish beneath the earth for months at a time? What kept them here? Trade routes, certainly. Agricultural land, yes. But there's another possibility. One that historians mention only in passing. Cappadocia wasn't just contested because of geography. It was vulnerable because of climate. And climate doesn't negotiate. It doesn't retreat after a season. It shifts. It destabilizes. It creates cascading failures. Drought leads to famine. Famine leads to migration. Migration leads to conflict. Conflict leads to collapse. And collapse leads to the next wave of invaders moving through a weakened region. The historical record documents the invasions. It rarely documents what made the region vulnerable in the first place. But the underground cities remember. Because if invasion alone justified Derinkuyu, you'd expect similar complexes across Anatolia. There are some, but none match this scale, which suggests Cappadocia faced something additional, something environmental, and something the stone could protect against in ways armies could not. And that possibility changes everything, because it means the doors weren't just sealing out enemies. They were sealing out the world itself. There are wine presses carved into the rock, not storage areas for wine brought from the surface, actual presses, which means grapes were brought underground, crushed, fermented, aged in darkness. This wasn't emergency rationing. This was production. The animal stalls tell the same story. Chambers designed to hold livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, feeding troughs carved into the walls, drainage channels for waste. These animals lived underground, not for days, for months, which means fodder had to be stored, water distributed, waste managed, all of it below ground. Meanwhile, archaeologists have identified communal kitchens, large hearths, smoke channels carved precisely to vent fumes away from living quarters, bread ovens, grain silos, storage jars embedded in the floors to keep food cool. The smoke management alone is remarkable. Cooking underground means dealing with carbon monoxide, soot, and heat. The ventilation system had to disperse smoke while maintaining breathable air across 18 levels. And it worked. Families cooked meals in total darkness by firelight, while 20,000 people breathed the same recirculated air. Then there are the chapels, multiple religious spaces carved into different levels, some with stone altars, others with carved crosses, evidence of baptismal fonts. Religious life didn't pause underground. It continued. Services held in darkness, scripture taught by candlelight, children memorizing prayers in chambers 200 feet below the surface, and schools, rooms designed for education, small benches carved into the rock, enough space for a teacher and a dozen students, which means parents made the decision that their children's education would continue, even if it meant learning in a cave, even if it meant growing up without ever seeing the sun. This reframes everything. Derinkuyu wasn't a crisis shelter. It was a parallel society, a society that functioned fully in the absence of daylight. But functioning doesn't mean thriving. Living underground for months has consequences. No sunlight means no vitamin D synthesis, bone weakness, immune suppression, developmental issues in children, psychological stress from confinement, disrupted circadian rhythms, depression, anxiety, claustrophobia, and yet families chose this. Not once, repeatedly, across generations, which means they weighed the risks. Surface world, invasion, violence, destruction, death. Underground, darkness, confinement, malnutrition, psychological strain. And they chose darkness, consistently. That calculation reveals something profound about what was happening above ground, because parents don't make that choice lightly. You don't take your children into darkness unless the alternative is worse. And the infrastructure suggests this wasn't a single traumatic event. One invasion doesn't justify wine presses. One siege doesn't justify schools. This is endurance culture. A culture built around the expectation that retreat is inevitable, that at some point, predictably, routinely, the surface world will become uninhabitable. And when that happens, you descend, you seal the doors, you light the lamps, you ration the grain, and you wait for weeks, for months, until it's safe to return. The archaeological evidence shows that some families did this multiple times in their lifetimes. Layers of habitation, repairs to chambers, expansions to living quarters. These weren't refugees passing through. These were residents. And the most unsettling detail is this: the children born underground. Because if you're sheltering for 9 months, some women will give birth in darkness, which means there were children whose first breath was stale, recirculated air, whose first light was firelight, who spent their earliest months in a stone chamber 200 feet below ground. And when they finally emerged, if they emerged, they would have no memory of it. Their earliest experiences would be darkness, confinement, and the sound of rolling stone doors. That's not trauma. That's formation. That's identity. What does it do to a society when this becomes normal? When children grow up knowing that safety lives underground? When the rhythm of life includes descent, enclosure, and waiting in darkness? Archaeologists can measure the chambers. They can date the carvings. They can trace the expansions, but they can't measure the psychological toll, the cumulative weight of choosing stone over sky, of raising children in caves, of building a civilization that only survives by disappearing. And yet, they kept doing it. Generation after generation, refining the systems, expanding the infrastructure, teaching their children how to live in darkness. Which brings us back to the beginning. Wine presses, schools, chapels, animal stalls. These aren't emergency measures. These are cultural institutions, transplanted underground, sustained underground, made permanent underground. The question isn't how they survived in darkness. It's what made darkness feel safer than the open sky. What recurring pattern of catastrophe convinces an entire society that their children are better off learning to read by candlelight in a stone chamber than attending school on the surface? That answer isn't written in the rock, but the rock remembers the choice. In the year 536 AD, the sun dimmed, not metaphorically, literally. Byzantine historian Procopius recorded it with precision. The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. He continued, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. Across the Mediterranean, chronicles describe the same phenomenon. In Italy, in Constantinople, in North Africa, the sky had changed, temperatures dropped, crops failed, snow fell in summer. This wasn't localized weather. This was hemispheric climate disruption. Modern scientists now understand what happened. A volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or the tropics, ejected massive quantities of ash into the stratosphere. The particulates blocked sunlight for over a year. Global temperatures plunged. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests collapsed. The Eastern Mediterranean experienced famine. Our Byzantine tax records document the collapse of agricultural revenue across Anatolia. And that wasn't the first time. Tree ring studies from the region show evidence of severe drought cycles throughout the first millennium AD. Prolonged dry periods, failed harvests, water scarcity. But the pattern goes back further. Around 1200 BC, the late Bronze Age collapse destabilized the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The standard explanation focuses on invasions, the sea peoples, collapsing trade networks, political fragmentation. But recent paleoclimate research suggests something else was happening. Drought, prolonged, severe, regional, tree ring data, pollen analysis, and sediment cores from lakes across Anatolia all point to the same conclusion. The climate shifted, rainfall decreased, rivers shrank, and agricultural productivity collapsed. And when agriculture fails, everything else follows. Trade breaks down, cities depopulate, armies can't be fed, empires collapse. But armies you can fight. Invaders you can resist. Drought doesn't negotiate. It just persists. And here's where Derinkuyu becomes impossible to ignore. The city is climate-proof. The temperature never changes, 13 degrees Celsius, year-round. When the surface bakes under drought, the underground remains cool. When temperatures plunge during volcanic winters, the stone retains warmth. The water supply is independent. Wells tap deep aquifers, insulated from surface contamination and seasonal variation. The food storage is extensive. Grain silos, wine storage, chambers designed to preserve food for months. This isn't just defensive architecture. On this is environmental insulation, a sealed system designed to survive surface instability. And the timing is suggestive. The earliest sections of Derinkuyu date to at least the 8th century BC, possibly earlier, which places initial construction within the shadow of the Bronze Age collapse, a period when climate destabilization contributed to civilizational collapse across the Mediterranean. Coincidence? Or institutional memory? Because here's the pattern. Drought leads to famine. Famine leads to migration. Migration leads to conflict. Conflict leads to more famine. It's a feedback loop, and it doesn't resolve quickly. Climate disruptions can persist for decades, generations, which matches the archaeological evidence. Derinkuyu wasn't built for short-term crises. It was designed for prolonged, recurring instability. Almost the kind of instability that comes not from armies, but from environmental collapse. And if you're trying to survive multi-year droughts, volcanic winters, and crop failures, going underground makes sense. Surface agriculture is vulnerable. Underground storage is protected. Surface water sources can be poisoned, contaminated, or run dry. Underground aquifers are stable. Surface temperatures fluctuate wildly. Underground temperatures remain constant. The architecture answers environmental threats as much as military ones. Maybe more, because you can hide from an army in a cave. But surviving a famine requires infrastructure, food storage, water security, climate stability, and that's exactly what Derinkuyu provides. The volcanic winter of 536 AD would have been devastating on the surface. Our crops frozen, livestock starving, populations displaced. But underground, stable temperature, stored grain, protected water, survival. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible. And if your ancestors survived previous climate shocks the same way, you'd maintain the infrastructure, you'd expand it, you'd teach your children how to use it. Because climate disruptions don't announce themselves. They just arrive. And when the sun dims, when the rains stop, when the crops fail, you don't have time to dig. You need the city to already exist. Which brings us to the unsettling implication. What if Derinkuyu wasn't built primarily for invasion? What if it was built for something more persistent? Something that couldn't be fought or negotiated with? Something that returned cyclically, unpredictably, across centuries. Environmental catastrophe, volcanic winters, drought cycles, climate shifts that lasted decades. The kind of instability that makes the surface world unreliable. And if that's true, it reframes everything. The doors weren't sealing out armies. They were sealing out a hostile climate. The food storage wasn't for sieges. It was for years when nothing grew. The water wells weren't for avoiding poison. They were for surviving drought. Derinkuyu isn't a fortress. It's an ark. Not against flood, against the sky itself. And the question that should haunt us is this. What did ancient Anatolians understand about climate instability that we've forgotten? What pattern did they recognize clearly enough to carve survival into stone? And what happens when civilizations lose that institutional memory? The plague of Justinian arrived in 541 AD. It started in Egypt, spread through Constantinople, then moved inland. Within months, it reached Anatolia. Byzantine historian Procopius recorded the devastation. At its peak, the plague killed 10,000 people per day in Constantinople alone. Bodies piled in the streets. Mass graves overflowed. The living couldn't bury the dead fast enough. The disease spread through contact, through breath, through proximity. Cities became death traps. Urban density, normally an advantage, became a liability. The more people concentrated in one place, the faster the contagion spread. And there was no cure, no treatment, just infection, fever, swelling, and death. Survival meant one thing: isolation, distance from the infected. Which raises an uncomfortable question about Derinkuyu. What if the city wasn't just built for invasions and climate disasters? What if it was also designed for quarantine? Consider the architecture. Each level can be sealed independently. The rolling stone doors don't just keep invaders out. They isolate populations. If illness breaks out on one level, you seal it. The infected remain contained. The healthy remain protected. The ventilation shafts are separated by level. Airflow doesn't mix freely between floors, which means contaminated air on level 5 doesn't reach level 12. And the water supply. Every well terminates inside the city, below ground, unreachable from the surface, which means the water can't be poisoned by an enemy. But it also means something else. It can't be contaminated by surface runoff, and no sewage seepage, no animal carcasses decomposing upstream, no agricultural runoff carrying disease. The water is as isolated as the people. This is medical infrastructure. Infrastructure designed to control contagion. And the timing is impossible to ignore. The plague of Justinian hit Anatolia during the 6th century AD, the same period when Byzantine Christians were actively using Derinkuyu, expanding it, maintaining it, carving chapels into the rock, which means they lived through the plague, and they had a place to go, a place where isolation was already built into the design, where 20,000 people could shelter without urban density, where levels could be sealed if infection appeared, where water couldn't be contaminated, where air circulated separately. This isn't coincidence. This is adaptation. But the plague wasn't the first epidemic to sweep through Anatolia. Historical records document recurring waves of disease throughout the first millennium AD. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, diseases that spread through water contamination, human contact, and poor sanitation. Diseases that thrived in cities, and cities were where people fled during invasions, which created a paradox. You retreat to the city for protection from armies, but concentrating populations increases disease transmission. Unless your city is underground, unless it's designed to isolate, unless the architecture itself prevents contagion. Derinkuyu solves the paradox. It provides the protection of urban concentration without the vulnerability of urban density. Because underground, you control airflow, you control water, you control movement between sections, you control who comes into contact with whom. On the surface, plague spreads through markets, through temples, through homes packed tightly together. Underground, plague hits barriers, stone doors, isolated ventilation, controlled access points. The disease can't move freely. It gets trapped, contained, starved of new hosts. And here's the haunting part. You can't see disease coming. Armies announce themselves. Dust clouds on the horizon. Scouts reporting movements. Climate disruptions give warnings. Crop failures. Drought. But plague just appears. One person falls ill, then another, then 10, then 100. By the time you realize what's happening, it's already spreading, which means you can't wait to react. You need infrastructure already in place, ready to seal, as ready to isolate, ready to protect. And that's exactly what Derinkuyu provides. The city doesn't just defend against visible threats. It defends against invisible ones, against enemies you can't fight, can't negotiate with, can't see until they're already inside your walls. And if you've lived through plague once, you remember. You remember the bodies, the panic, the helplessness. You remember that cities become tombs, and you build accordingly. You expand the underground city. You maintain the ventilation. You protect the water supply. Because next time, and there will be a next time, you need a place where isolation is possible, where survival doesn't depend on urban density, where stone walls separate the sick from the healthy. The question historians rarely ask is this: if war destroys cities and plague empties them, which fear shapes architecture more deeply? Armies you can see, plague you can't. Armies have motives, strategies, patterns. Plague has none. It just spreads. And when it arrives, your only defense is distance, separation, stone doors that seal from the inside. Derinkuyu offers that. not as an afterthought, as design. Which means the architects understood. They understood that survival isn't just about fighting. It's about isolation, about creating barriers between the living and the dying, about controlling the invisible. And the most unsettling implication is this. If Derinkuyu was designed with plague in mind, then the people who built it expected disease to return, not once, repeatedly, across generations. They built for recurrence, for the certainty that at some point the surface world would become contagious. And when that happened, survival meant descent into darkness, into isolation, into stone, away from the invisible enemies that couldn't be fought, only avoided. Derinkuyu is not alone. 9 miles north sits Kaimakli underground city, 8 levels deep. Capacity for approximately 5,000 people. Ventilation shafts, rolling stone doors, water wells, food storage, the same architectural logic, the same defensive design, the same commitment to sustained underground habitation. Then there's Ozkonak, 10 levels, 4 miles of tunnels. Defensive holes in the ceilings where residents could pour hot oil on invaders. And Tatlarin, and Marzi, and Derinkuyu's own smaller annexes scattered across the volcanic plateau. Archaeologists have identified over 200 subterranean complexes across Cappadocia, some small. Just a few chambers, others massive, comparable to Derinkuyu itself. And here's what changes everything. Some of them are connected, tunnels running for miles beneath the surface, linking city to city. You could travel from Derinkuyu to Kaimakli without ever seeing daylight. Underground highways carved through solid tuff. This isn't isolated construction. This is a regional network, a subterranean civilization spanning hundreds of square miles, which raises an uncomfortable question. Who builds a network? You build one city for local defense. You build a network when the entire region is unsafe. And the scale suggests coordination, not just within a single generation, but across centuries. Because linguistic and archaeological evidence shows something remarkable. These cities weren't built by one civilization. Oh, they were inherited, expanded, adapted. The earliest sections, possibly Phrygian, date to the 8th or 7th century BC. Then Persians occupied the region in the 6th century BC. They expanded the tunnels, added infrastructure. Then Greeks arrived with Alexander. They modified the ventilation, carved additional chambers. Then came the Romans, then Armenians, then Byzantine Christians. Each civilization found the tunnels already there, and instead of abandoning them, they went deeper, added levels, expanded storage, improved the defenses. Generation after generation, culture after culture, all making the same decision. Underground is survival. This isn't panic. This is institutional knowledge. Knowledge passed down across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The Phrygians carved the first chambers. The Persians taught the Greeks about the tunnels. The Greeks showed the Romans. The Romans left records for the Byzantines, and each group expanded what they inherited. Because the threat, whatever it was, didn't disappear when empires changed hands. It persisted. Across languages, across religions, across political systems, the surface remained unstable. The underground remained reliable. And here's the revelation that should unsettle us. This means the fear was cumulative. Not the fear of one invasion, not one plague, not one drought. The fear of recurrence. The knowledge, proven across centuries, that catastrophe returns. And when it does, stone is safer than sky. Because if the threat were temporary, one generation would have abandoned the cities, let the tunnels collapse, filled them in, moved on. But they didn't. Or they maintained them, expanded them, connected them, which means every generation validated the fear of the previous one. The Persians looked at Phrygian tunnels and thought, yes, we'll need these. The Greeks looked at Persian expansions and thought, yes, and we'll need more. The Romans looked at Greek infrastructure and thought, yes, and deeper. Each era confirmed what the previous era knew. The surface world is not reliable. Prepare accordingly. And the tunnels connecting the cities reveal something else. Mobility. If one city is compromised, you retreat to another. If Derinkuyu falls, you move through the tunnels to Kaymakli. If Kaymakli is breached, you continue to Ozkonak. The network provides redundancy, fallback positions, layers of retreat within retreat. This is strategic depth, not at the city level, or at the regional level, which means the architects were thinking beyond local defense. They were planning for scenarios where multiple cities might be threatened simultaneously. Scenarios where survival required not just hiding, but movement. And that scale of planning suggests something historians rarely emphasize. The instability wasn't episodic, it was systemic. Cappadocia wasn't experiencing isolated crises. It was experiencing chronic, multi-generational insecurity so severe that entire civilizations, across centuries, agreed on one thing. The earth is safer than the sky. And here's the question that lingers. What does it mean when multiple civilizations, separated by centuries and languages, independently arrive at the same conclusion? That survival requires going underground. Not temporarily, not as emergency shelter, but as infrastructure, as routine, as the expected response to surface instability. It means the pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. The surface world, across millennia, proved itself unreliable. Invasions, yes. Climate disruptions, yes. Plague, yes. But also something deeper. A recognition that civilization itself is fragile. That continuity requires preparation. that the next catastrophe is always coming. And when it arrives, you need more than walls. You need depth. You need isolation. You need a place where the collapse of the surface world doesn't mean the collapse of your society. The network beneath Cappadocia is proof. Proof that ancient humans understood something we've tried to forget. That safety is never permanent. That stability is always temporary. That survival, real survival, requires accepting that the world above will fail you. And when it does, you descend into the stone, into the dark, into the network that generations before you carved, maintained, and expanded, because they knew. They knew the surface wouldn't hold, and they built accordingly. The question we should be asking is this: what did they see across centuries, across empires, across catastrophes, that convinced them stone was more reliable than sunlight? And what happens to civilizations that forget that lesson? The doors still work. Modern archaeologists have tested them. After more than 2,000 years underground, the massive stone wheels still roll on their tracks, still seal corridors completely, still lock from the inside. The mechanisms haven't degraded, the tracks haven't warped, and the engineering remains functional, which means if you descended into Derinkuyu today, found one of those 400-pound stone doors, and pushed it closed, you'd feel exactly what they felt. The weight, the resistance, the finality. That moment when stone meets stone and the corridor seals. When the outside world disappears. When survival means accepting that you've just locked yourself in darkness. And the fact that the doors still function after millennia reveals something profound about the builder's intent. They didn't build for temporary use. They built for permanence, for the assumption that these doors would need to work decades, centuries, maybe millennia into the future, because the threat wasn't going away. It was cyclical, expected, inevitable. The engineering reflects that certainty. Precision that lasts 2,000 years isn't accidental. It's deliberate preparation for recurrence, and the military architecture confirms it. Every corridor in Derinkuyu is a calculated defensive position, narrow passages that force invaders into single file, low ceilings that prevent full combat stance, sharp turns that eliminate sightlines, choke points where one defender can hold off dozens, murder holes positioned at ambush angles. This isn't improvised defense. This is tactical mastery translated into stone. An enemy entering Derinkuyu faces a nightmare. No visibility, no room to maneuver, no way to bring superior numbers to bear. Defenders who know every turn, every trap, every kill zone, and if one level falls, you seal the stone door and retreat to the next. 18 levels of fallback positions. Each one defensible, each one sealable. An invading force would have to fight for every meter of corridor. And even if they succeeded, what would they gain? Darkness, empty chambers, sealed doors, leading nowhere, because the residents would have already retreated deeper, sealed themselves in, disappeared. This is defensive architecture perfected, not through walls that can be breached, but through depth that can't be conquered. Layer after layer of stone, door after door, level after level, until the invader realizes the truth. You can't storm Derinkuyu. You can only wait for it to starve. And with months of food storage, protected water, and functional ventilation, that wait could last longer than any siege. But the military genius is only one layer. The human cost is another. All because choosing this defense means choosing confinement. Families made that choice. Parents looked at their children and decided that months underground was preferable to weeks on the surface. That darkness was safer than daylight. That stone ceilings and recycled air were better than open sky and fresh wind. Think about what that decision requires. Not just courage, calculation, a clear-eyed assessment that whatever is happening above ground is worse than psychological confinement, vitamin D deficiency, and raising children in caves. That calculation appears throughout the archaeological record. Animal stalls, wine presses, schools, chapels. These aren't emergency measures. These are cultural institutions transplanted underground. Which means the residents didn't just endure darkness. They lived in it, maintained social structures, educated children, practiced religion, produced food, all while sealed beneath 85 meters of rock. And they did it repeatedly, across generations. Which brings us to the paradox. Why? Why build a city this elaborate, this deep, this sustainable? If you're only hiding from occasional raids, why maintain and expand it across centuries if the threat is temporary? Why connect it to other underground cities if the danger is localized? The answer is that the threat wasn't singular. It was layered, cumulative. Derinkuyu wasn't built for one catastrophe. It was built for all of them. Invasion. Yes. The Hittites collapsed. The Persians invaded. The Romans annexed. The Arab forces raided. The Mongols swept through. Wave after wave of armies crossing Cappadocia for over 2,000 years. Religious persecution. Yes. Early Christians fled underground during Roman crackdowns. Chapels carved into rock-bare witness. Climate instability. Yes. The Bronze Age collapse. Regional drought cycles. The volcanic winter of 536 AD. Tree rings document decades of environmental stress. Famine. Yes. Crop failures. Collapsed agricultural revenue. Byzantine tax records confirm repeated food crises. Plague. Yes. The plague of Justinian. Recurring epidemics. Diseases that turned cities into death traps. Each threat alone justifies refuge. But not this scale, not 18 levels, not infrastructure for 20,000 people, not a regional network of connected cities. That scale only makes sense if the threats overlap, if invasion coincides with drought, if drought triggers famine, if famine enables plague, if plague weakens defenses against the next invasion. History doesn't deliver crises in isolation, it stacks them. And Derinkuyu was designed for stacking, for scenarios where multiple catastrophes arrive simultaneously or sequentially, where survival requires not just hiding from one threat, but insulating against systemic collapse. The ventilation protects against plague. The water system protects against drought and contamination. The food storage protects against famine. The doors protect against invasion. The depth protects against climate extremes. Every system addresses a different failure mode. Together, they create resilience, not against a single disaster, against cascading failure. And that reveals something historians rarely emphasize. The paradox isn't that ancient humans overreacted, it's that they were right. The historical record confirms their assessment. Anatolia experienced repeated overlapping crises for over 2,000 years. Derinkuyu exists because the pattern was undeniable, because every generation validated the fears of the previous one. The Phrygians carved the first tunnels after witnessing the Bronze Age collapse. The Persians expanded them after experiencing their own invasions. The Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines each faced their own catastrophes, and each chose to maintain, expand, and refine the underground cities. Not because they were irrational, because they were pattern recognizers. They understood something fundamental about civilization. That stability is temporary. That catastrophe recurs. That the surface world, no matter how prosperous, how stable, how secure it seems, will eventually fail. And when it does, survival depends on preparation. Derinkuyu is that preparation, carved into stone, refined across centuries, maintained across empires, a testament to the recognition that crises return, not randomly, not occasionally, predictably, repeatedly. And the most unsettling implication is this: we've forgotten. Modern civilization operates on the assumption of continuity, that supply chains will function, that governments will remain stable, that climate will be predictable, that diseases can be controlled. We've built a world optimized for efficiency, not resilience. We've abandoned depth for speed, redundancy for cost-effectiveness, local self-sufficiency for global interdependence. And in doing so, we've lost the institutional knowledge that built Derinkuyu, the knowledge that catastrophe is normal, that crises stack, that survival requires preparation not for one disaster, but for the pattern. Ancient Anatolians spent over 2,000 years carving that knowledge into stone. They built cities that could survive invasion, plague, drought, famine, and climate shock simultaneously. They created networks that provided fallback positions when individual cities failed. They designed systems that remained functional across centuries, not because they were primitive and superstitious, but because they understood what we've chosen to forget. That the world is fragile. That civilizations collapse. That the next crisis is always coming. And when it arrives, resilience isn't optional, it's survival. The doors still roll. All the ventilation still functions. The wells still reach water. After more than 2,000 years, Derinkuyu still works. Which raises the final haunting question. If an entire civilization across multiple empires, languages, and religions, prepared to live underground for months at a time, maintained that infrastructure for over 2,000 years, and passed that knowledge down through generations, what did they understand about the world's instability that we've forgotten? And what happens to civilizations that forget?